Florida.
Thank you, Madam President. As you may have heard a moment ago, one of the amendments that's being objected to on our end is an amendment that I have filed, and I want to describe it briefly. And let me back up let me first describe the issue I'm trying to address. And I am in a moment going to ask for unanimous consent that a newspaper article from the South Florida Sun-Sentinel be entered into the record. In fact, let me go ahead and do that now. I ask unanimous consent that an article dated U.S. welfare flows to Cuba from October 1st of 2015 be entered into the record.
Without objection.
So I'm going to not read the whole article, but I'm going to paraphrase from it. And by the way, on the Democratic amendments that have been proposed, the senator from California just made a presentation on travel issues and pilot hours, and she referred to the fact that I've traveled extensively over the last year. It's an issue I'm actually very sympathetic towards, and perhaps we can work together to get her a vote on that amendment, because I think that is a legitimate issue. Now let me talk about the one I want to talk about. So here's how the article begins. And I talked about this yesterday. Let me back up and explain to people what we're facing. Today, if an immigrant enters the United States from another country, legally, comes here on a green card, 5-year residency, they cannot receive federal benefits. If you immigrate to the United States from any country in the world with an immigrant visa, legally, not illegal immigration. Illegal immigrants do not qualify for federal benefits. A legal immigrant to the United States does not qualify for any federal benefits. There is an exception in the law, however, and that is if you happen to be someone that comes from Cuba without a visa. There is a law called the Cuban Adjustment Act. And what the Cuban Adjustment Act was passed during the Cold War, it was passed so that when Cubans came to the United States fleeing communist oppression, they were immediately admitted into the United States. In essence, that is why there is really no such thing as an illegal immigrant from Cuba. Because if a Cuban makes it to the shores of the United States, they become legally in this country, and a year and a day after they have arrived, they are allowed to apply for a green card. But unlike any immigrant from any part of the world, they are allowed to receive federal benefits because they are automatically presumed to be refugees. And that is a status, by the way, that I'm not trying to change in terms of the Cuban Adjustment Act. I've said I'm open to that being examined, but I'm not trying to change that law in my amendment. All I say, but what I do want to discuss is why should you automatically assume at this point that anyone that comes from Cuba is a political refugee? And the reason why that now is in doubt is because many of the people that are coming from Cuba, supposedly as refugees seeking to flee oppression, are traveling back to Cuba 15, 20, 30 times a year. And so it is hard. Look, are there political people being oppressed politically in Cuba? Absolutely. It is one of the reasons why I think the president's policies towards Cuba have been misguided, because they refuse to see that even after this opening to Cuba, the political situation on the island has deteriorated. It's gotten worse, not better. There are absolutely people from Cuba that are coming here as refugees. But we also cannot ignore the fact that many of the people coming from Cuba no longer are coming here for political reasons. And the evidence is that shortly after they arrive, they're going back to Cuba 15, 20, 30 times a year. You do not normally travel back to a place that you are fleeing from oppression, much less repeatedly over an extended period of time. And so as a result, we now have a law that basically says if you come from Cuba, you are automatically entitled to a full platform of federal benefits. Okay? Here's how the article begins. Cuban immigrants are cashing in on U.S. welfare and returning to the island, making a mockery of the decades-old premise that they are refugees fleeing persecution at home. Cubans' unique access to food stamps, disability money, and other welfare is meant to help them build new lives in America. Yet these days, it is helping some finance their lives on the communist island. America's open-ended generosity has grown into an entitlement that exceeds $680 million a year and is exploited with ease. And there's no agency that tracks the scope of this abuse, but a Sun-Sentinel investigation found evidence suggesting it is widespread. Fed up Floridians, where a lot of these Cubans are moving to, are reporting their neighbors and their relatives for accepting government aid while shuttling back and forth to the island, selling goods in Cuba and leaving their benefit cards in the U.S. for others to use while they are away. And some do not even come back at all. the United States has continued to deposit welfare checks for as long as 2 years after the recipients moved back to Cuba for good. Now, it goes on to talk for several people. For example, there's a shopkeeper in Hialeah, Florida, where a lot of these folks are coming and moving. He says he hears about it all the time. He's a barber. He's been in the U.S. for 3 years, and he said that recent immigrants on welfare talk of spending considerable time in Cuba, 6 months there, 2 months here. You come and go before the benefits expire, he said. The article goes on. It quotes that there's a sense of entitlement that has become so ingrained that Cubans are now routinely complaining to the local congressman about the challenge of accessing U.S. aid from Cuba. What they are complaining about is they're coming into the office. Here's what an aide to a former congressman from Miami said. This is his quote. A family member would come into our office and say another family member isn't receiving his benefits. And we'd say, where is he? And they'd say, he's in Cuba and he isn't coming back for 6 months. This is unreal. There are people coming into congressional offices complaining, we're having trouble getting access to our benefits. And you ask them, well, why? And they say, because the person whose benefits is not in America, he's in Cuba, and he can't get access to his benefits from Cuba. One woman told Miami immigration attorney Grisel Ibarra that her grandmother and 2 great-aunts came to Florida, got approved for benefits, opened bank accounts, and returned to Cuba. Month after month, the women cashed their government checks, about $2,400 each time, sending half to the women in Cuba, and by the way, keeping the rest for themselves, a 50% commission. When a welfare agency questioned the elderly lady's whereabouts this summer, the woman turned to Ibarra, a Cuban American herself, and she told her that her grandmother refused to come back, saying, quote, with the money you've been sending me, meaning with your money, the American taxpayer money, I bought a home and I'm really happy in Cuba. Ibarra went out to say that the Cubans on the island have a name for this U.S. aid. It's called La Ayuda, which means the help. Now, Cubans are allowed into the U.S. even if they arrive without permission, and they're quickly granted permanent residency, as I said earlier, under the 1966 Cuban Adjustment Act. They are assumed, automatically assumed, to be refugees without having to prove it. And so they're immediately eligible for welfare, for food stamps, for Medicaid, and for supplemental Social Security, or SSI, and also cash assistance for impoverished seniors and for disabled young people. But not all let's be frank, not all Cubans receive government aid. For example, if you come to the United States from Cuba on a visa, because there is a visa lottery, and every year the government awards visas to people living in Cuba, if you come from the United States on a visa, you do not qualify for these benefits. If, however, you arrive in the United States on a raft, or if you fly on an airplane to Costa Rica, Honduras, Guatemala, or Mexico and cross the U.S. border, as is now increasingly happening, then you do qualify for these benefits I've just outlined. So let's be frank, not everyone who's coming from Cuba is doing this, and there are people coming from Cuba that are fleeing persecution. But many are taking advantage of the easy money, and then they're going back and forth from Cuba. I'm going to give you some examples cited in this article. A public housing tenant in Hialeah who was receiving food stamps and SSI payments for a disabled son frequently traveled to Cuba to sell food there, records showed. She admitted to a city housing investigator in 2012 that she makes $700 in 2 months just in the sales to Cuba. $700 a month is a lot of money in Cuba. How does this work? They take the food stamp card, they go to the grocery store, they load up a bag with canned goods, they travel back to Cuba. They just bought that food with your taxpayer money. They travel back to Cuba with a duffel bag full of canned goods, and they sell it in Cuba for a profit, $700 over a 2-month period. Another man receiving food stamps admitted to state officials that he was living in Cuba for much of the year 2015. A recent arrival with a chronic illness got Medicaid coverage, and then he turned to his attorney from Miami to help him get SSI as well. But the man was going back and forth to Cuba so much that the attorney eventually dropped its case because it was just another benefit he was applying for. This, of course, concerns people who came to Cuba as exiles and are now watching this happen. There's a doctor. His name is Noel Fernandez. He recalls that when his family arrived here from Cuba, that the U.S. government helped them a little bit when they immigrated here 20 years ago. They helped him to find work as a landscaper. It helped him to learn English, and it helped him to complete his medical studies. Today, he's the medical director of Citrus Health Network in Hialeah. Fernandez sees Cuban immigrants collecting benefits and going back, including 3 elderly patients who recently left the United States for good. They got Medicaid, they got everything, and they returned to Cuba. I see people that said they're refugees from Cuba, and they return the next year. That's his quote. State officials in my home state of Florida have received complaints about Cubans collecting aid while repeatedly going to Cuba or working as mules, ferrying cash and goods, which is a common way of financing travel to the island. And how that works is people know you're traveling to Cuba, and they have relatives that they want to get money to or clothes to or whatever, and so they pay you. They actually pay you. They give you money, and they say, well, you take this with you on your trip to Cuba and deliver it to the people we're trying to get it to. That's why they call them a mule. Well, from the money that you get paid to take these things back to Cuba, that's how you pay your plane ticket. Another way of paying for these trips, by the way, is cheating. Like other welfare recipients, some Cubans work under the table, or they put their assets in another name to appear poor enough to meet the program's income limits, according to records and interviews. Some married couples qualify for more money if they are single. Many of our welfare programs, they actually give you more money if you're not married, because you don't have to combine your income. And so, because they were married in Cuba, they simply conceal the fact that they're married, because the U.S. can't access those records. That's another way of cheating. Now, look, accessing benefits from someone who's in Cuba typically requires a U.S. bank account and a willing relative or friend stateside. By the way, that's just for now, because as part of this opening to Cuba, the Obama administration is going to make it easier for there to be banking transactions with Cuba. So what we are facing here, my friends, is when in a very short period of time, once banking becomes regularized with American banks, they won't even need to rely on their relatives in order to get this stuff. All they're going to need is an ATM or debit card or a credit card secured to that account, and you, the American taxpayer, will deposit the welfare checks, the SSI, into their bank account, and then they will be conducting transactions or withdrawing the cash from Cuba directly. So they won't even need the relatives to do it. But right now they still need that. Food stamps and welfare are issued monthly to a debit-type card, and SSI payments are deposited into a bank account or onto a MasterCard, which soon you will be able to use in Cuba. Then what you need is a joint account holder with a PIN number who can withdraw the money and wire it to you in Cuba. Another option is just to entrust the money to a friend that's traveling to Cuba. So Roberto Pisano, who's a Tampa, a political prisoner for 18 years in Cuba, said that he worked 2 jobs when he arrived in 1979, and he never accepted government help. But now he sees immigrants abusing the system. He says he has a family friend. This family friend got disability money from the U.S. And with the disability money, he renovated his house in Cuba. The Sun Sentinel found this man. His name is Gilberto Reyno. They found him. You know where they found him? They found him living in Camagüey, Cuba. When they found him and they interviewed him, he said he was no longer receiving disability. But Pisano, an other person familiar with the situation, said that the payments continued to be deposited into his U.S. bank account. Here's another example that federal investigators found. In 2012, a complaint alleged that a 75-year-old woman had moved to that same city, Camagüey, Cuba, 2 years earlier, and that a relative was withdrawing her SSI money from a bank account and sending it to her. Now, luckily, Social Security finally stopped the payments, but only after nearly $16,000 had been deposited into her account. Here's another story of a recipient that went to Cuba on vacation and then stayed, leaving his debit card with a relative. Social Security continued his SSI payment for another 6 months, $4,000, before finally an anonymous caller reported that he had gone back to Cuba. Another woman reportedly moved to Cuba in 2010 and died 3 years later, while still receiving SSI and food stamps, according to a 2014 tip to Florida welfare fraud investigators. 5 Cubans interviewed by the Sun Sentinel in Havana said they were aware of the assistance, and they knew of Cubans who had gone to America and quickly began sending money back. 2 said they believed it was U.S. government aid, meaning this is now spreading through word of mouth. So you live in Cuba, you know someone that left to the United States, they qualified for these benefits, and they start coming back and bringing the money with them or sending it back to their relatives, word gets around. And that's why it's not a surprise that outside welfare offices in Hialeah, Florida, the South Florida Sun-Sentinel found Cuban immigrants who had arrived as recently as 3 days earlier already applying for benefits. And they said that family and friends are the ones that told them about the aid before they left for Cuba. Back in the 1960s when you came in, they told you the factory that was hiring, said Nidia Diaz of Miami, a former bail bondswoman who was born in Cuba. Now, they tell you we're the closest Department of Children and Families offices, so you can go and apply for benefits. Another Miami bail bondswoman, Barbara Pozo, said that many of her Cuban clients, they talk openly about living in Cuba and collecting monthly disability checks, courtesy of U.S. taxpayers. They just come here to pick up the money, Pozo said. They pretend they're disabled. They pretend that they're crazy. SSI payments for those who cannot work due to mental or physical disabilities go up to $733 a month for an individual. Most other new immigrants are ineligible until they become U.S. citizens, by the way. Some Cubans are trying to build a case for SSI by claiming trauma from their life under an oppressive government or from the 90-mile crossing to Florida. But Diaz, who I just spoke about a moment ago, the former bondswoman, said she has heard Cuban clients talk about qualifying. This is her quote. This is what she hears them saying to each other. Tell them that you have emotional problems. How did you get these problems? Well, trying to get here from Cuba. End quote. Here's the one that should really gall everyone. I mean, these are all bad stories. An individual by the name of Antonio Comín. He collected disability while organizing missions to smuggle Cubans to Florida, including one that he launched from a house in the Keys, federal prosecutors said. Comín claimed that he rented the home to celebrate his birthday after receiving his government check. Casimiro Martinez was receiving a monthly check for a mental disability, but his mind was sound enough to launder more than $1 million stolen from Medicare. Martinez was arrested at Miami International Airport after returning from a trip from Cuba. By the way, while benefits are supposed to be suspended for recipients who leave the United States for more than 30 days, you know how the government finds out whether you left for 30 days or not? It relies on people to self-report their absences. And federal audits have found widespread violations. So the only way you can find that someone's actually doing this is they have to call you and say, hey, by the way, I'm now living in Cuba and I'm still collecting my checks. Well, that ain't going to happen. This is an outrage. Listen, my parents came from Cuba. I live in a community where Cuban exiles are a plurality of the people who live there. So no one can say this is an anti-immigrant thing or a mean-spirited thing. It is, we have the support for this idea of every elected Cuban-American member of the House. I myself come from a Cuban-American family. This is an outrage. It's happening right underneath our nose. Who can be for this? Let me rephrase it. Who can be against doing something about this? We are talking close to $700 million a year of American taxpayer money that could be spent right now to deal with the Zika virus issue that we're facing, for example. And instead, this money is being abused. It's being stolen. So you would think, wow, that's a common sense thing, right? People here in the gallery, people at home, if anyone's actually watching C-SPAN, you watch this and say, that's common sense, right? I mean, that's common sense. They're going to do something about it. I can't get a vote on an amendment. I cannot get the Senate to vote on an amendment to stop this practice. Here's the only thing I'm asking. I'm asking that if you come from Cuba, you have to prove that you are a refugee. Prove to us. I'm not even saying we're not going to let you in. I'm just saying that if you come from Cuba using the Cuban Adjustment Act, prove that you've been persecuted in Cuba. That's not hard to do. You were in jail. You were beaten. You've got other people. We know who the people are that are being persecuted. All we're saying is prove that you're a refugee, and then you'll qualify for the benefits. Because we help refugees. But apparently that's too much to ask. Now, here's the thing. Everybody here comes up to me and says, I'm for your amendment. I support what you're trying to do. Well, great. Well, why can't we vote on it? Well, we can't vote on it because if we give you your amendment, then we have to give the other side their amendment. And let me just tell you guys, this is why people are so sick of politics. I don't want to get too much into the weeds on this. Suffice it to say, I've spent from April 13th of 2015 to very recently traveling all over this country on another endeavor. And One of the things you hear from people, they're just angry. They're just fed up. They think, we elect, no matter who we elect, who we vote for, who we send to Washington, nothing changes. Nothing ever happens. Doesn't matter. You can vote for a Republican, you can vote for a Democrat, you can vote for a vegetarian. It doesn't matter who you vote for. Nothing happens. These people don't do anything. They're right. I've just come here today and laid this out. No one can argue this. No one can argue against what I just said. No one. I challenge any member of this Senate to come here now. I'll give you the rest of the time I have apportioned to me and tell me why changing this is a bad idea. But I can't even get a vote on an amendment to change this. And the excuses are long. Oh, we can't do it because we don't want to open the tax portion of the bill up because then other people will want their amendments. This is crazy. This is nuts. We can't solve problems. We can't solve something as clear and simple as this. We can't even get a vote on it. A vote. You want to vote against what I'm proposing? Vote against it. We can't even get a vote on an amendment like this. It makes no sense. And this is just, it's not a small issue. We're talking $700 million. But this is not an issue of national coverage. It's not in the news every day. This is not controversial. This is bipartisan. The chairman of the Democratic National Committee, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, a congresswoman from Florida, is a co-sponsor of this bill in the House. But this is not partisan. It's not about getting anyone elected to anything. I'm not running for anything. This is about doing what's right. This is about not being able to go back to my home community and say to people, this abuse has been addressed. But if I go home tonight or tomorrow to Florida, when I go home, and I run into somebody at a grocery store, I can't explain to them with a straight face why the Senate won't give me a vote on this. Because it makes no sense. If I came to you and said, they are stealing $700 million a year from you, and here's a very simple way to stop it, you would say, let's do it. We got to do it. They're saying we can't do it. And no one will tell you why we can't do it, except some procedural internal Senate thing. This is ridiculous. This is why people are angry. This is why people are so upset. This is why people have taken on this attitude to get rid of everyone. And I got to tell you, it's hard to blame them after you see what's happening here now. This is a total, complete outrage. There's another amendment, by the way, being debated by Senator Sessions. It's another one of the amendments that was denied a vote. It has to do with the entry-exit tracking system, which basically means that when you come into the United States with a visa, you get a visa to visit the United States for 90 days as a tourist. You want to go to Washington, you want to go to Disney World, you want to go to New York City, and you have 90 days to visit the United States. When you arrive, we check you in, but we never check you out. And so we never know when someone left. And as a result today, of the 12 or 13 or 14 million people that are here illegally, about 40 or some percent of them are people that overstayed visas. They didn't cross the border illegally. They came on an airplane, and they overstayed their visa. Everyone says they are in favor of a system that tracks entries and exits so we can crack down on these overstay of visas. Everyone says they're in favor of it. In 2013, the Senate passed a controversial immigration reform bill that I was a part of and we helped craft, and an entry-exit tracking system was part of that bill. Everyone, Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative, everyone says they're in favor of doing that. But you can't get a vote on it. Makes no sense. This place can't solve anything. And this is ridiculous. And so what happens when you don't solve things for a long time? The problems stack up. The problems stack up. And people lose confidence. People lose faith. Now look, I understand this process. I know that everyone's not always going to get everything. You're not going to achieve everything you want when you get involved in these issues. But these are common sense issues. An entry-exit tracking system, of course that makes sense. And by the way, you have to do that on the FAA bill. You have to, because that has to do with airports where most of the entry exits are happening. This issue is drafted to this bill because this bill has a piece of it that deals with the tax code and the finance. A moment ago, the chairman said, well, we had a lot of debate. He did. They had an open amendment process on the FAA bill. But there's a finance component to this bill that was not offered until it got here. And that's what my amendment is drafted to, so I couldn't have offered this in a committee. But I just think, people come to Washington, they watch this process, they hear me explain this thing, they're wondering, well, there's got to be a catch, right? What is the other side of the argument? There is no other side to the argument. There is none. There is none. Why should you, the people watching, the people here, why should anybody, why should the American taxpayer be giving money to people to build houses in another country that don't live here? And that's what's happening right underneath our nose. And you can't, forget about passing it, you can't even get a vote on it. for reasons no one can explain. And so you want to know why people are upset and frustrated at the political process? This is just a small but important example of why people are so frustrated. I hope this will change. I hope it will change. I hope it will change on this bill, because I don't think you can explain with a straight face why something like this can't pass, or why something like this can't even get a vote on it. This makes absolutely no sense. But this is what's happening here every single day on a routine basis. And in Washington. And the result is people start to scratch their heads and say, you know what, it doesn't matter who we elect. Nothing changes. And that explains a lot about the frustrations that are going on in this country. So I hope that will change. I do want to talk about